Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I am here with the first ever episode of my podcast, Beyond the Board. This is going to be a podcast about history and culture behind board games, and I have an absolutely fabulous first guest, Dr. Chris Dobbs, who wrote his dissertation on ancient board games. Want to say hi to us, Chris?
Hey, hey.
Thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to tell us first, really quick, about the academic work that you do?
Absolutely. I work at the University of Missouri. I'm in the Learning Center and I work as a tutoring coordinator. So I hire, I train, and I manage a large team of tutors who help their peers with whatever their academic needs are. But then I also get to work with students directly, help connect them to different resources, and make sure that they have all of the support that they need to be successful. And then on the side, I teach for the Honors College all sorts of different courses about the ancient world, board games, leisure, fun, Latin literature, anything that I think students will really enjoy. I actually just get to design my own courses, and they have filled up every semester, which makes me really excited. And then I also do some research on the side because I'm at a university and have access to one of the great academic libraries available.
So, what is the most exciting class that you've taught so far?
The most exciting class for me has been my course Board Games in the Ancient World. We start off in ancient Egypt, look at some games, move to Greece, and then we end in Rome. And depending on what my students want to do, sometimes we move to sub Saharan Africa just very briefly. We always explore what the games played in each culture mean to that culture and to our own lives. So the Egyptians had strong religious associations with their board games. And when I introduce that idea about Mehen or Senet, often students look at me with a little smile, or like they're really puzzled and say, well, how could anybody think that there could be spirituality from a board game? And then I hit them with the Ouija board. And suddenly all the smiles sort of drop and their mouths open. They say, oh my goodness, we do the same thing. We have this thing that was invented as a game, and we then started to ascribe religious significance to it, a sort of spiritual power. And as soon as students realize, wow, you know what? We do this thing that I at first thought was sort of weird, then everybody realizes we're not so different, right? There's a real continuity of humanity and the human condition, and games serve as a lens for us to understand exactly what those continuities are.
So, what is the spiritual significance of Senet? I did not know that it had religious implications. I've just seen images of ancient Egyptians playing it.
Sure. So to understand that, we sort of have to shift one game earlier, chronologically, to Mehen, which starts off. So it's in the shape of sort of a coiled serpent, and players move their pieces, at least as far as we understand, from the outside towards the inside, where the snake's head is, and then back around. And so this symbolizes escaping from Mehen, who starts off as an evil deity in the Egyptian pantheon. And if you escape from this evil deity who's trying to destroy Ra, right, in the afterlife, then you have symbolically achieved immortality, the sort of life after death. And then the game starts to lose popularity because Mehen shifts from being an evil god to a good god because everybody
Ooh.
really likes this game. But then to carve one of those boards, you have to get squares carved onto that coiled serpent, which means you're cutting up a god. And so to carve out a deity is blasphemy. So people stop playing that game, and that's where Senet, this 3 by 10 grid, really starts to take off in popularity almost as a replacement. And that board we can see from different tomb paintings and from different texts in the pyramid texts or the Book of the Dead, uh, different descriptions, we should say, of how the game board serves as a conduit between the living realm and the spirit world. So that's a way that we can actually talk to deceased loved ones. They can channel their spirit through the Senet board, almost in the same way that we talk about Ouija boards in modern culture.
So you can have both a competitive game and an otherworldly experience all in one convenient gaming package.
Absolutely. It sort of does it all, one stop shopping.
Fantastic. And what kind of games did the Greeks and Romans play? Of course, I'm a classicist, so that's my favorite.
Yeah, absolutely. The Greeks and Romans played all sorts of different games, including uh, a really fun version of tic tac toe that dates back thousands and thousands of years. We find it in Egypt, we find it in Greece, we find it in Rome, we find it still to the modern day. This Merrill's game, where after the pieces go down, they then get to move around the board. Often this is a 9 by 9 grid instead of a 3 by 3 grid, and it's one of the most common games in world history. So it's called Merrill's or Morris. Often you'll hear about Nine Men's Morris, and that's the iconic 9 piece version. And what I really like about it is that once the pieces go down, we think it's just like tic tac toe. But then when they start to move, it has this whole extra dimension to it. Instead of just getting 3 in a row, when you get 3 in a row, you get to take one of your opponent's pieces off the board. So now it's 9 pieces versus 8, then 9 versus 7, then 8 versus 7, and back and forth, and the battle keeps going. They also had different dice games or games using knuckle bones, which are 4 sided randomizing agents taken from the ankle or the talus of originally sheep, but also other animals. And the Romans in particular had a really great game called Alia and its precursor Duodecim Scripta, where it's set up with 36 spaces, typically 6 words of 6 letters each, put in a 3 by 12 grid. And these words form fun little messages. So we can have just circles or squares or anything else to mark the playing surface and show where the pieces go. But I love the boards that use letters instead because they form really funny messages. So often we'll see attestations of power. Something that says, oh, the empire is so strong and the enemies have been beaten, so let the Romans play on without fear. There's even one that's a menu that's been found outside of a tavern that just says in Latin, we have for dinner chicken and fish and ham and peacock.
Oh yeah, so it's kind of like the equivalent of the peg game at Cracker Barrel, except that it also has a utilitarian
Yes,
purpose.
exactly. So anyone who's walking by who is sort of initiated into the gaming circle, they know. They can say, "Oh, wow, that's not just a menu, that's also a gaming table." And I know that I can get my gambling game on in there. And they'll have a lot of fun with it. And what I really think is neat about that game is how mean some of these boards are. You typically don't want your game board to be mean to you, but some messages include things like, if you win, then you get to celebrate. But you don't know how to play, so you lose and you cry. And it's bad enough that you're losing this board game against your friend, but then when you look down and not the board game, but the game board itself is calling you a crybaby, it just adds this extra dimension of fun to everything about this game.
That sounds delightful. And you also mentioned that Duodecim Scripta has an element of gambling to it, but gambling was not considered socially acceptable or illegal at various points in the Roman Empire. So, how did this game continue to be so popular that it was on the restaurant menu in such a hostile climate?
Sure. So, games that involve dice have a chance element, right? Of course, because throwing dice, that is an actual roll of chance, a roll of the dice, quite literally. And all of those games were assumed to have gambling. Obviously, we know that we can play poker or backgammon without gambling on it, and yet any backgammon set you buy has that doubling cube in it, which is specifically for betting. And unsurprisingly, backgammon is a descendant of duodecim scripta. So even in its very origins, all the way through to the modern day, we assume that gambling is part and parcel of the game. So it had to be played in secret. It had to be played inside. The Roman Forum has a couple hundred different board games etched into the pavement on temple steps, in the middle of roads, and these are a couple hundred boards that are still visible to the modern day. But what's fascinating is absolutely none of them are duodecim scripta. We find those in taverns, we find those in houses, we find those in some of the provinces. For instance, in Timgad, we find one by a colonnade in the Forum. But in Rome proper, these are all hidden. And yet we know people are playing. Cicero mentions in a letter that if he's having a philosophical conversation with someone and that person wants to, as it were, take back a move as if they were playing duodecim scripta, he'll let him retry what he wanted to say. So we know that people are playing from these casual references and from the dozens of boards that we have found, but these boards are always hidden away or are portable in some way so that they can be, sort of shoveled off to the side if the E-dials are coming to bust up the party.
So basically, you can tell people not to gamble, but they are absolutely going to etch their game boards everywhere, carry game boards all over the place, and then just act like they weren't doing anything when you catch them.
Absolutely. Cicero is my favorite example of that because he gets so angry about games. He says, "Oh, I can't believe that people would play games. Oh, these terrible people, they're so slovenly and lazy." He goes on and on in many of his works, especially about how people waste their whole lives playing games. And then when we look at his private correspondence, sure enough, he's playing games because he talks about it, but he has his very public display of virtue, what he knows will be circulated immediately, where he says, no, 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 games are bad. And then he has his private life.
That is delicious. But we also know that not all games of this time period were games of chance, right? We have sort of a relative of chess that is an ancient Roman game as well.
Yes, Ludus Latrunculi, or Ludus Latrunculorum, which translates to the game of little soldiers or the game of little robbers, depending on how you want to translate that last word. It looks a lot like chess or checkers, but we should note that there's no actual connection between them that's been proven. But it's really difficult to find a good way to explain the game because it's two players facing off against each other on a board that's usually 8 by 8 squares. So, for all intents and purposes, it looks just like chess, and you'll see lots of translators actually use chess as the word to describe this game. And yet, as far as we can tell, it has no direct relationship with chess or any similar games of that family. But here we see it mentioned in, for instance, a bit of praise poetry from the first century CE, the Laus Pisonis, where it's mentioned that he's so good at this game that everybody comes rushing over to watch. They're playing their games, and he's great at playing ball games out in the middle of the forum, and everybody abandons their own games to go watch Paizo play. And then he starts playing board games as a way to relax his mind from all the weight of his studies and from being such a good leader in the Roman world.
Oh,
And
jeez.
he binds his opponents, he captures their pieces, and his whole hand starts to rattle because as he captures the pieces, he keeps them in his hand and he shakes it, and you can hear this rattling because he has so many of his opponent's pieces captured in his hand.
That is hilarious. And also, I think a really interesting indication of games being problematic for your character in some contexts, but in others, an indication that you're very skilled and smart, but perhaps also relatable.
Yes. So to use Cicero as another example, um, or as I guess as an example once again, in the De Oratore in Book 3, he actually says that when day laborers are kept from their jobs because of the weather, so they can't go out and work, then they just waste their time. And one of the ways that they waste their time is on playing these games. They will play ball games or knucklebones, or they'll invent a new game just to waste their time. And then, almost in the same breath, he talks about aristocrats who have been cut off from their work because the times are so dangerous that nobody wants to work in politics. There have been assassinations and civil wars and uprisings. This is around the same time that Catiline has his infamous conspiracy. But when aristocrats are kept from their work, according to Cicero, then they devote themselves to wholesome, intellectual, virtuous things, including music and philosophy and literature, and sure enough, inventing new games. But when it's the aristocrats' games, he says that they specifically turn young people's minds towards virtue. So if you're on the in crowd, then games are great and you can invent games that make you a better person. But if you're not on the in crowd, if you're on the outs with Cicero, then when you invent new games, you're simply wasting your time.
So, the idea of novelty is also an interesting thing to discuss, particularly in the context of ancient Rome and Greece, partially because Romans don't like new things typically, and also because Plato has some comments about commitment to tried and true games versus constantly looking for different entertainments, if I recall correctly.
Yes, absolutely. In the laws, he mentions that people legislate the same way that they played as children. So anyone who has constancy in their games as children, they play the same games in the same ways, meaning with the same rule sets, in my interpretation. Then they legislate and they govern with constancy. But anyone who had too many new games, too much novelty, who always wanted to try a new tactic or a new rule, then they change laws just for the sake of changing them, which leads to the detriment of civilization. It always reminds me of the German philosopher Hegel, who said that all progress is good, but not all change is progress. And that's exactly what we see in Plato discussing how people legislate, whether they might change the laws simply for the sake of changing them, rather than leaving well enough alone if you have a strong constitution already.
Ooh, that is really interesting. It's also interesting that you mentioned theorizing that Plato is referring to playing by the same rules, because how do we even know that people in the ancient world were playing by the same rules from place to place, much less over time? Do we have any written rules for any of these games?
By and large, no. We have just simple side references here, a small allusion there in the literary record. We don't have any actual rule sets written down. So everything that we know is put together sort of piecemeal from different texts, different bits of archaeological evidence, especially when we find boards and pieces, and also from paintings or art when we have them. Vase paintings can show us, oh, okay, there's one person on one side of the board, another person on the other. It seems to be a one player versus one player game, as long as we can link what we see in the picture with the archaeological evidence and with the literary record. Often that's not possible, and there is almost certainly regional variation. Hence why we see certain evolutions in game boards, especially Duodecim Scripta and Alia moving from 3 rows to 2 rows. In the archaeological record, we find different numbers of dice, different numbers of knuckle bones, especially in burials. And although we can't prove it, we would love for someone to have a complete set. That is probably unlikely, especially with all of the hazards that go into unearthing a tomb that's 2000 or 2500 years old. We can never be completely sure. But we do the best that we can, and ultimately, even if we can't reconstruct every game to being perfectly playable. What we can do is show the literary and especially the social significance of those games on the cultures in which they're played.
So I have a question. You mentioned looking at a vase and seeing one player versus one player and deducing it's a two-player game. Are there any games from the ancient world that aren't two-player games other than athletic games?
When we look at ancient India, we seem to have four-player games. It is also possible that a version of Mehen in Egypt was a four-player game. We have nothing, to my knowledge, that really resembles solitaire or a one-player game. Certainly, it would be possible for someone to sit down and really think, okay, if my opponent does this, I can do that, in the same way that chess players will play both sides of the board in practice. But in an actual game, sort of to completion, it really seems to have that antagonistic, competitive streak that we find so prevalent in the ancient world.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that so many of the games do seem to lend themselves to one versus one play. It's very, to me, it seems very much like it's about one person competing against another and having an intense rivalry instead of like a game night where four people get together and play something and there's a winner.
Yeah, exactly. These games all seem to be really trying to deduce a single victor as opposed to everyone getting together and just playing for fun where it doesn't really matter who wins. Uh, I think it's really great when friends can get together and just have a good time while they happen to be playing a board game. But in the ancient world, it really seems to be if you're playing a game, you are playing to win.
Ooh. So I have a modern day question. I know that you are a skilled chess player, uh, but is that the full extent of your interest in modern board games? What are you playing?
So I love to play modern games, and yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a chess player. I did the sort of competitive circuit as much as I could. Later in life, it became more difficult, especially to travel around to all of the different tournaments. But it was never a profession for me. So for the chess players in the audience, I'm a Class B player. So if you bring in 1,000 random people off the street, I'll beat 1,000 of them. But if you put me in a tournament with actual good players, I'll lose every time. Which is a really weird way to describe it, as I've spent thousands of hours honing my craft, and yet I, in fact, have met 10-year-olds who are way better than I'll ever be. But that's sort of the nature of chess. Settlers of Catan is a personal favorite. And in high school and college, I really adored playing Risk with friends.
Did you?
I did. I find Risk and Catan and Monopoly and sort of that whole suite of games really fun.
So I have a question for you. As a person who spends his time studying what ancient people's games say about them, what do you think that our games say about us?
I'll actually just use those same games as an example, since they're sort of iconic games that if not everybody has played, certainly everyone has heard of them. So
Absolutely.
so ostensibly, Catan is about gathering resources, right? And making sure that you have enough wood or sheep. Risk is ostensibly about power and domination, and Monopoly on the surface is just inherent capitalism and gathering wealth to the detriment of others. But when we dig a little bit deeper, all three of those games actually appeal to our core humanity. All of them are about security. They're about having enough to protect ourselves through the vicissitudes of fortune. They're about making sure we can protect our loved ones by making sure that we have enough wealth to weather a storm. In Monopoly, that would be landing on someone else's property with a hotel on it. You want to make sure that if bad financial luck comes your way, you will be secure. In Catan, you want to make sure that you have enough resources that you're never wanting for anything so that you can have the best life you can. And in Risk, the whole purpose of having the army, of dominating, is to get more land, which gives you more soldiers so that you know if someone launches an attack, you are safe. So all of these games, although they seem to be wildly different, really all just speak to the human condition and our want to be secure.
That is a really interesting way of looking at modern games, and I'm now really curious about how that will apply to other games that I play. How do you think the traditional games that we still play, like chess or backgammon, fit into that? Why do we play those? Do you think that they create some of those same feelings, or is it about skill, or is it just upholding a tradition?
I think it's a little bit of everything. Certainly, we have to look at how the games developed. So when we think about chess, right, we're not 100% certain, or scholars don't all agree on the history of chess, but certainly it seems to be about the fourth century, right? India, Persia. We have Chaturanga that then continues to evolve. We certainly have this military style game with the different pieces denoting the different branches of the army. But then it changes, right? Originally, there was no queen piece. There was the vizier, who was the advisor to the king and was incredibly weak. Moved like the king, but only diagonally. So only one square at a time and only diagonally. Really a just awful piece to have on the board. And then fast forward to just a couple centuries ago, women are gaining power. We have such strong queens in Europe that the piece was adapted into the queen as we know her today, with all the powers of a bishop and a rook combined. We went from the worst piece to the single best piece on the board in response to societal change. So we can have games that have sort of their origin stories that still respond to contemporary needs, however it is that we need them to.
Do you think that chess still has the capacity for change, given how regimented our tournaments have become? Or would any evolution of the game happen in something like blitz chess and just different ways of playing?
So chess, sort of classic chess, will always be classic chess. It will always have its adherents, but we will have many more variants in the future, just like we have in the past. The advent of Bug House, where you have two players on a team, but side by side on two different boards, so that each team has one player playing with the white pieces and one player playing with the black pieces. And then when someone captures a piece, you actually give it to your teammate, and that person can put it in on their own board. We also have Chess 960, or as it's traditionally called, Fischer Random Chess, right? Because Bobby Fischer, 11th world champion, the American, he really advocated for this new version of chess where the whole back row is completely randomized. And that now has an official world championship that has been going on for a few years. We've seen chess boxing in just the past half decade or so, where you alternate playing chess and, yes, boxing. So we'll always have different ways to use the same base for different purposes. We'll see different time controls. There used to be games that would last several days, right? And players would go back to their hotel rooms and could analyze overnight and then come back the next morning with a game plan. But with the advent of chess computers, that all had to go away to make sure that everyone was on a level playing field. So we'll always see evolutions, we'll always see changes and variants that are all fun and exciting in their own ways. But for chess specifically, I think classic chess is certainly here to stay.
Interesting. So, as an archaeologist who studies remains of board games, if you could choose one of our games to survive for the next 2,500 years, that historians like us find it, what would you choose and why? Let's assume that the rules are going to break down because those are made out of paper.
Sure, I would love for chess to keep going because I think chess has a lot to offer in the ways that it speaks to music and art and math and forming cognitive abilities. but we can't really say that chess is one of our games, since that's something that we have inherited over the past couple of millennia. But I think that Monopoly is an iconic game that really encapsulates everything that we are, including the fact that it was sort of stolen, right? It started off as the landlord's game, but when we dig deep into the history, I saw a great talk on this. It was actually modeled very closely on, or in the modern day, we might even say completely plagiarized, a Native American game. So the fact
Really?
that it shows sort of this iconic imperialism, the sort of colonial idea that what's yours I can take and make for my own, and it encapsulates the idea of a race, of competition, of bartering over different pieces or different properties. I think it has a lot to say about how we view interactions with one another, how we compete, or work together, how we can cooperate to take down one player who seems to be doing a little bit too well. And if the rules disappear, well, that's kind of okay because everybody plays with different rules anyway. As much as we hate to admit it, the way that we all grew up playing Monopoly may not be what's in the actual rules about whether you get to take extra turns when you roll doubles. Do you have to go to jail if you roll doubles 3 times? Uh, but also, are you allowed to swap properties? Can you sell properties to one another or only to the bank? If so, can you do it only on your turn or can you have backroom deals during other people's turns? And all these subtle variations make for a much more vibrant, dynamic playing experience because you have to establish what the rules are at the start of every single game, or at least once you get into your first argument about it. So if archaeologists have to have those same arguments 1,000 or 2,000 years from now, looking at one of our games, then really they're just playing the same game we are.
So, one more question before I let you go. What is the weirdest or funniest thing that you have encountered in your research into ancient games?
The weirdest thing I would say is how ancient Romans describe games and sex all sort of in one breath. So Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, or the Art of Love, tells women that they have to learn all sorts of different games. They must learn marrows and dice and knucklebones and Ludus Latrunculorum to make sure that they can win a man, because love is often won through playing games. But then he also tells men that anytime they're playing a game with a girl they like, these men need to lose on purpose. Throw the dice in the worst way possible. If you can, get the worst roll possible with the knuckle bones. Let her take your pieces in Ludus Latrunculorum, and never, have a bad attitude about it, but let her win, because if she wins, she's going to be in a great mood, and if she's in a great mood, then your relationship can progress.
Progress. That's the perfect way to put it.
Exactly. But if the men are going to let the women win, then why do the women have to learn how to play in the first place? Right? It's a fun mental hurdle to overcome, to think about why we have these flip sides of the coin. But really, Ovid is playing a game with his readers as he's telling them to play actual board games with one another.
That is both charming and something that I'm very glad that we no longer have to do, because I'd be really insulted if a man let me win.
Absolutely. It does not stand the test of time. Certainly, uh, a good part of flirting over a board game is showing that you fully believe the person you're playing with can beat you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for this wide ranging conversation about archaeology, politics, and even some romantic advice. Chris, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time. You've been a fantastic first guest.
I appreciate you having me on, and small disclaimer, that's Ovid's advice. Try it at your own risk.
Definitely at your own risk. So, on the internet, you can always find me pretty much anywhere at Beyond Solitaire on any social media. But, Dr. Dobbs, is there anywhere where people can reach you if they have questions, comments, or further interest in ancient games?
You are free to email me. My email address is dobbscs for Dobbs Christopher Stephen at missouri.edu. Or if you just Google Chris Dobbs, Missouri, I'm sure I'll be the first link there.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Chris, and happy gaming, everyone.